About a month ago, I was contacted by the instructor of Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary's Cross-Cultural Encounters class. She was requesting for the class to visit our campus to hear about our church's theological perspectives, ministries, and offer an introduction to the prayer labyrinth. I replied with an enthusiastic yes. I absolutely love the opportunity to talk about our church, especially when invited to do so, which then doesn't feel like some kind of creepy evangelism because we're allergic. They asked about our church's history with women in ministry and LGBTQIA inclusion. They loved the watershed art, took lots of pictures, and were amazed to know that there's a church that cares deeply about ecological justice. Their faces lit up as they connected the dots between the Indigenous History and Reality series and peacemaking as the center of our work. They were inspired by the way that we practice communion. This class consisted of 22 students who are training in the marriage and family therapy program and one studying to become a chaplain. I invited Janice Lepke to join me and give the tour here in the sanctuary. I've heard her talk before about the theological perspectives that influenced the design of the architecture, and I wanted to soak it up again. One of my favorite parts is when she talks about the resemblance of the sanctuary to a ship, and the fact that a ship or boat is an ancient symbol for the church. These really wonderful memories from this visit came up in my mind as I began to consider the gospel reading from Matthew this morning. The traditional reading of the story is that the problem was that Peter took his eyes off Jesus, which caused him to sink, and that if we don't get distracted by the storms of life and just keep our eyes on Jesus, we won't sink either. But there's a bit more to it than that. Having mentioned the symbolism of the boat, let's have a word about the sea. In the ancient world, across cultures, the sea represented primordial chaos. In the biblical tradition, Warren Carter says, stormy waters represent political unrest and tyranny, which God is able to overcome. In the Gospel of Matthew, that also includes the chaos and trauma that people in Jerusalem would be experiencing after the year 70, which was when a Jewish revolt was crushed by the Romans and the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. So by the time of the writing of the Gospel of Matthew, it had been a good 40 plus years since Jesus was crucified, resurrected, and ascended into the heavens. And the followers of Jesus have been trying to find their way forward ever since. In our first class last Sunday afternoon with Warren Carter, he emphasized that the Roman Empire wasn't just something in the background of the gospel, but was the foreground itself. In other words, it wasn't merely the backdrop or the setting for the story, but part of what moves the storyline forward. As Carter said to us over Zoom, you woke up in the morning and you stubbed your toe on the ancient Roman Empire. I wish I could do it with his New Zealand accent, but I'm not going to even try. This was a new way of thinking for me and has helped me look at this passage in chapter 14 with fresh eyes. As part of the foreground, Carter shared, Rome's imperial domination was exercised in 5 primary ways. 1, territorial, as in dominion over the land, the seas, and the production from them in the form of taxes and tribute. The second was a strict hierarchical and societal structures. You don't break the rules. Number 3 is economic realities that included slaves and other laborers, resources, and again, taxes and tribute. 4th was military domination, which included real threats, public executions, and gendered subordination that portrayed conquered peoples as submissive women. And finally, ideological domination that deeply affected mental and physical well-being of everyone. Against all of this, Carter sees Matthew's gospel as offering a counter-narrative to Rome's claims of domination. So all of this has me asking, what is the counter-narrative on deck when examining this story of the stormy sea, Jesus walking on water, and Peter sinking? Most of the commentators that I came across compared and contrasted this story with the one from chapter 8, where Jesus and the disciples are out at sea during a storm, and Jesus is in the boat with them, asleep. The disciples are afraid, and they wake him, and he calms the seas. But wondering about the larger counter-narrative at work, I felt I needed to go back even more to the very beginning of the gospel and the claims made about Jesus' identity from the beginning. In chapter 1, Jesus is introduced as Emmanuel, God with us, and that his mission is to be a manifestation of God's saving presence. So let's keep this in mind as we look at our story in chapter 14. It begins in verse 22 with immediately. Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Immediately after what? If you were here last week, you might remember the story before communion of the feeding of the 5,000 men, not including women and children. And just before that, Jesus had received news of the execution of his cousin, John the Baptizer. So he retreats to the wilderness in grief, is followed by a crowd, miraculously multiplies 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes to feed everyone, and then immediately makes the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of them to the other side, presumably the other side of the Sea of Galilee, since they end up at Gennesaret. Jesus sends everyone away and goes up to the mountain alone to pray. Many translations say that this takes place early in the morning, but the Greek gives it a little bit more specificity. The 4th watch, which is a military term of saying between 3 and 6 a.m. The waves have been violent, and it seems the wind has been against them all night. But there are seasoned fishermen aboard, and the text notes that they're not terrified until they see Jesus walking on the water, because they think he's a ghost. While we might be inclined to find a way to dismiss this possibility or reason it away as silly, it's a ghost, there's no such thing as ghosts, the possibility that Jesus is a ghost is not qualified in any way by the text. Jesus speaks to them first with an unmistakable claim of identity. Ego eimi, he says, I am. That's the answer God gave to Moses when Moses asked for God's name. This would not be missed by Matthew's audience. But Peter's response is where it gets juicy. If it is you, command me to come to you on the water. The reason Peter's words should be raising eyebrows is because the only other time this kind of phrasing is used in the Gospel of Matthew is by the devil in chapter 4 during the temptations, by the high priest during his interrogation of Jesus before his execution in chapter 26, and by those mocking him as he hangs on the cross in chapter 27. So Peter asking to be called out on the water isn't the heroic expression of faith that I always thought that it was. It was a challenge to Jesus' identity, not a wondering, a test. Jesus says, all right then, come on. Peter gets out of the boat, seems to be walking toward Jesus, sees the strong wind, and begins to sink. It actually might be a bit more like drowning, since the Greek word is literally to go underwater. He cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus grabs hold of him, saying, you of little faith, why did you doubt me? So here's the question. What did Peter doubt? Did Peter doubt that Jesus would let him walk on the water and only started to go under when he took his eyes off of Jesus? Or did he doubt that Jesus was the manifestation of God's saving presence and decide to test Jesus? It seems that his cry, "Lord, save me," is when he finally gets it right. No one slaps him on the back and commends him for his heroic act of faith when he gets back in the boat. They say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." I think we read this story as an act of heroic faith on the part of Peter because maybe that's what we want for ourselves. It's what we think real faithfulness looks like. But Peter isn't meant to walk on the water. He's meant to be in the boat with the other disciples. Remarkably, the only other time this same confession that is made by the disciples appears throughout the gospel comes from the mouth of the centurion at the foot of the cross after Jesus dies, saying, "Truly, this man was God's Son." If this feels like a little bit of a letdown compared to the moral of the story to keep your eyes on Jesus so you don't sink, I get it. The counter narrative offered here doesn't overthrow the oppressive tax rates or reestablish fair trade routes on the seas. But more than God having power over nature or even over Roman territorial or economic domination, I wonder what effect a superior counter narrative would have on the psyches of the post-70 CE, post-destruction of the temple group of traumatized Jesus followers. Is troubling and disrupting the narrative of Roman domination, dispelling that myth, is that enough to break the spell and cast doubts on Rome's claims? Is it enough to ignite hope? What I think is important to remember from the temptations in chapter 4 is that, like Rome, the devil only offers power. Warren Carter observes, quote, "But as the gospel will subsequently indicate, the divine purposes embrace not only power, and Jesus will display plenty of power throughout, but also suffering, rejection, pain, and death." End quote. This is the counter-narrative. Most of us know from experience that life is full of stress and trauma. It is full of pain and grief. But to know that God's saving power is with us in the midst of that is the ship that can carry us through to the other side. May it be so. Amen.